It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on applying win-win strategies to achieve economic development and climate goals. My name is Benjamin Smith. I'm the Knowledge Management and Partnerships Officer at the Green Growth Knowledge Platform Secretariat. Before we begin today's webinar, I'd like to provide a few words of introduction. The GGKP is a global community of organizations and experts committed to collaboratively generating, managing, and sharing green growth knowledge. Originally established a few years ago by the Global Green Growth Institute, the OECD, the United Nations Environment Programme, and the World Bank, the GGKP is now a global partnership of more than 50 leading international organizations, research institutions, and think tanks. We are delighted to be hosting today's webinar entitled, Can We Achieve Economic Development and Climate Goals Together? Applying Win-Win Strategies. The webinar will present early findings from the GREEN-WIN project. GREEN-WIN is funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. GREEN-WIN addresses the European Commission's call for proposal for linkages between climate change actions and sustainable development. The project is developing governance models and implementation solutions to address climate change. This webinar will outline early findings from the project on integration of climate strategies, access to sustainable development finance, flood risk management in coastal regions, and transformation in urban areas. Before I introduce our first speaker for today's event, I'd like to highlight a few logistical issues. First, we strongly encourage participants to raise questions to the speakers throughout the webinar. This can be done by typing your questions into the chat box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the webinar dashboard. Your questions will be submitted for our technical staff, who will then repost them to all participants for panelists to address during the Q&A period. We will also be circulating a survey after the webinar concludes. The survey takes less than 5 minutes and provides us valuable feedback to help shape future webinars. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the GGKP website within 24 hours. Finally, if you have any technical issues with the webinar, please email us at contact@ggkp.org and we will help you troubleshoot. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Sandy Pizarro. Sandy is an economist and researcher at the Global Climate Forum, a lead institution on the GREEN-WIN project. Sandy has 10 years of experience in climate vulnerability and adaptation research, both in Europe and developing countries. His current research focuses on climate finance and adaptation, governance, particularly in coastal areas. Sandy holds a PhD in resource economics from Humboldt University in Berlin. Sandy, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, and it's my great pleasure to turn over the virtual podium to you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Yeah, thanks very much for that introduction. It's a kind introduction, and good afternoon to everybody. Welcome. It's my pleasure to moderate this session on addressing the question of whether we can achieve economic development and climate goals together. And exploring some win-win strategies to do that. I'm going to just give a brief introduction to what we'll be covering today in the webinar and to some of the speakers. And so before I do introduce the speakers, let me just give an overview of what this webinar covers. As I said, the goal is to explore work so far in the GREEN-WIN project that has aimed at identifying and critically assessing win-win strategies. And by win-win strategies, we mean strategies that meet economic goals in the short term, as well as addressing climate goals, so mitigation and adaptation goals. This is, at the moment, an important question because both because in the context of the Paris Agreement, where voluntary contributions is the basis of that agreement, so economic considerations are clearly an important part of commitments for climate action, and it's becoming even more important in the wake of the U.S. election and discussions on their participation, the U.S. participation in Paris going forward. Analyzing win-win strategies seems to be a very timely subject, and this is what the GREEN-WIN project addresses itself towards. Specifically, some of the specific questions that the project goes into and that we'll be exploring today are whether the green growth concept and the green economy concepts have the potential or can live up to their promise and potential. Another question is how we can switch our economies to green growth pathways and what kind of policy instruments are available for doing that. A complementary question is, of course, what are the green business models that are involved in these transitions and in meeting or implementing such win-win strategies? So what business models exist that meet climate goals and economic goals at the same time? So to get some answers to these questions, we have a panel of 4 members of the GREEN-WIN project, and I'll introduce these 4 speakers now. First up, we have Jochen Hinkel, who is the GREEN-WIN project coordinator and a senior researcher at the Global Climate Forum. And Jochen will introduce the GREEN-WIN project and its objectives in more detail than I've done now, and also provide some case examples of win-win strategies that are being carried out in the project. The second speaker today is Nadia Amelie, who's a senior research associate at the University College of London, and she will be providing insight on the institutional investor perspective based on work that she's carried out with private institutional investors and their preferences and views with respect to green growth and green economy investment opportunities. The third speaker is Mark DeBell, an expert economy advisor from Deltaris. He'll be speaking to us today about identifying win-win strategies in flood risk reduction. And the final speaker is Yuji Ma, a postdoctoral research assistant from the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. And she'll be speaking to us about urban transitions and specifically about the co-evolution between sustainability and business innovation with evidence from the sharing mobility sector in Shanghai. So without further ado, again, thank you very much for your participation, and I look forward to an interesting set of presentations and your questions following that. So I would like now to hand over to Jochen Hinkel.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to speak at this webinar here. Thanks, Sandy, for giving the context of what we're doing. So I don't really need to go into that much more. I'm just going to try to give you a bit of an overview of what the GREEN-WIN project is doing, as well as the kind of structures, project partners we have in place. So let me start with giving you an overview of who the GREEN-WIN consortium is. So the GREEN-WIN project is funded under the Horizon 2020 research program of the European Commission. The call name was already mentioned by Ben. It is about linking climate change and sustainable development. Our project started about 1.5 years ago, and so basically we have reached half-time and we have another 1.5 years to go. The budget is roughly 4 million euros. In our project, we have 16 core partners, most of which are in Europe, which naturally has to do with that being a European-funded project. We have a couple of partners in other G20 countries, so it's Cape Town, it is Bogazi University in Turkey, and it is Udaya University in Indonesia. Plus, we have another 26 associated partners. So those are partners that conduct research from the similar perspective as the GREEN-WIN project, but don't receive funding from the European Commission. However, they contribute to the results of the project, to our workshops and our conferences. So let me first explain you in a bit more detail what we are really after and why we're doing what we want to do. So the core objective of the project is twofold. First, we want to contribute to overcoming barriers to climate mitigation and adaptation by discovering and critically assessing win-win strategies. So by win-win strategy, we mean strategies that meet both climate goals as well as economic goals. Sandy has already mentioned two of those strategies. One is known under the name green growth. That would be bringing more economic development through addressing climate issues to a national economy, for example, and the other one would be a green business model. Our second objective then is to co-develop shared narratives around those win-win strategies that we have identified, and to do that collaboratively among scientific, policy, business and civil society sectors, because we think it's quite important to build strong stories about why we can actually achieve economic goals through addressing climate goals at the same time. So why are we emphasizing this? Why are we doing this? If you look at the literature on climate change, and myself, I've been involved in this research for over 20 years, you still find that most climate literature focuses on what we call long-term comprehensive strategies. So you find literature having pictures like the one here in my slide. It's a long-term mitigation pathway then leading to a certain climate goal by the end of the 21st century. And yeah, that's sort of the general way we conceptualize the climate problem, that we as a globe then need to find a strategy that brings us down to this goal. So the whole exercise is carried out from the perspective of a global planner who could steer the world towards a climate goal. This research has been very useful in bringing climate change onto the agenda and informing also the international negotiations, but we think it has been less useful in actually bringing about change on the ground, because societal change rarely follows these global long-term strategies. What we find in evidence is that usually changes are messy. We walk into one direction for a while, we make some mistakes, we correct, we walk back, we try again, etc. So really this availability of global long-term strategies has not led to action. And it's not really surprising, because those global strategies, they're not really formulated to be attractive from the perspective of individual countries, households or entrepreneurs. Usually we have a strong incentive to free ride, and also not many countries are really willing to sacrifice economic growth for climate for meeting climate goals, for good reasons, because the economic development is important for a healthy country and also for keeping the income levels justice across the country. This has been manifested in the Paris climate agreement, where we actually have switched from the whole idea of having a global system to a country level system where countries do voluntary contributions towards reaching the global goal. We also have a rich literature that is reporting on a lot of barriers that occur why climate action doesn't manifest itself on the ground, and this is often associated actually to a lack of profit or a lack of finance for doing climate action on the ground. So the GREEN-WIN project focuses on exactly this. So this is where we start our research, and we want to find strategies that are attractive for individual actors such as countries or entrepreneurs or households, and that can be implemented now. In order to be attractive, strategies have to be economically attractive, so they have to bring an economic benefit for the implementing actor today, so not in 20 or in 50 years, because economic agents have to do or have to address short-term economic budget issues in order to survive in today's economy. So this is why we look at what we call green growth strategies and green business models. The latter would help people to make a living now and at the same time to contribute to emission reduction or other climate goals. Specifically, we're focusing on overcoming financial barriers in implementing these strategies, because if you think about win-win strategies, actually, if they exist, they should automatically be realized because they offer this win-win opportunity. So often this is not the case, like I said before, simply because finance is missing for the realization of the win-win strategy, and this is why we specifically look at financial barriers and ways for overcoming them. So how do we do this? Well, we are looking for evidence, so can we empirically observe when, where, and under which conditions win-win strategies occur? Towards this end, we run a number of case studies that on the one hand do empirical research on the evidence of existing win-win and green business models, but we also do action research on implementing and developing green business models while we go along doing our research in the cases. The cases cover 3 domains of action. The first one is flood risk management, so this is an adaptation domain. The second one is the domain of urban transformation, focusing on the mobility energy nexus in cities, and the third domain covers rural and poor areas, focusing both on mitigation and adaptation goals, such as in, well, for example, decentralized renewable energy production. For all of those domains, we look at finance. We do policy analysis on the financial arrangements, on the kind of finance that is available, and also on a more macroeconomic perspective, we do macroeconomic modeling, trying to find theoretical evidence how green growth could work. I will not so much speak about the macroeconomic modeling because in this webinar we focus more on the case studies. This is our work plan. I'll skip that because we don't have so much time. So how do we approach this issue of identifying win-win opportunities and helping to overcome financial barriers? Well, we are working on a typology of win-win solutions, showing the kind of economic incentives that actors are facing. Then we look at how those economic incentives can be matched to the incentives investors and funders are facing. And the second presentation of Nadia will give a couple of insights on this question. And specifically important here is, of course, whether we are speaking about profit-oriented investors or also impact or green impact-oriented investors and donors. So we're looking at the whole set of different funders and possibly finance instruments. And then finally we ask the question, how can the financing barriers be overcome? So which kind of financial instruments are needed to match-make between the win-wins and the investors and funders on the other side? I'm just going to give you now a couple of examples on what kind of win-wins we are envisaging, and those examples are for different economic actors. So if you think about households, the main win-win opportunity here is really to reduce the cost or the expenditure through climate action. So on the mitigation side, this would be to introduce energy efficient measures in buildings. On the adaptation side, that could, for example, be flood-proofing the buildings and thus suffering from less losses during a flood. Firms can, of course, do the same thing as households in terms of reducing costs. In addition, firms are selling products, and so they can generate a revenue through climate action. And specifically, if you think about selling green products, this is what green business models do. And an example there, a prominent one, would be energy service companies that are actually helping households and firms to realize win-win opportunities on the level of the household or on the level of the firm. Finally, we have public actors that, of course, can also reduce their costs through climate action. This is the similar situation as we have for households and firms. But we also have the possibility of generating revenues through implementing climate measures. And next to selling green products, what normally is not really the state's role, states can sell the co-benefits of their climate actions. So just to give you an example, if, for example, through a flood protection measure, a public actor creates new land that is valuable because it's protected against floods, that land could be sold, and in this way the public actor can actually recuperate part of the investment costs through those buying the new land generated. Another standard way of generating revenues for public actors is, of course, taxing the beneficiaries of climate action. And again, in the domain of flood protection, that would be a prominent way to move forward. Finally, and we're not going to talk so much about this option, at the level of the whole economy, we can think about public actors greening the economy by providing an investment stimulus to the economy and thus helping the economy to grow faster while at the same time becoming greener. All of those possibilities for win-win opportunities sit, of course, in an environment that may enable or hinder that action. And in our research, we are specifically looking at that environment. One aspect is, of course, whether green business models or win-win opportunities only exist because the state supports them financially. So this could be through grants or through taxes, etc. Other aspects of the enabling environment which are important are, of course, culture, networks, institutions, or any other kind of social structure and incentives in which such win-win strategies and green business models emerge. Finally, one specific question we're also asking in all of the cases we are conducting is, so what kind of enabling environment would then be needed for replicating and upscaling the green business models and the win-win opportunities that we find? Thank you very much. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yes, hi, thank you. I think you can all hear me now. Before we move to Nadia, just thanks very much to Jochen for that overview presentation on GREEN-WIN. I would just remind you all, we've had a few questions coming in, so please continue to send those in. We will have a 30 minutes question and answer period to all of the panelists following the final presentation. So now we're going to hear from Nadia Amelie on the institutional investor perspective on the green economy and climate investment. So I'll turn over now to Nadia. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sandy, for the nice introduction. And now let's just 1 second for the just want to set the presentation. Okay, thanks a lot, Sandy, for the introduction. And today I'm going to present some of the work that we are doing here at UCL in terms of climate finance. In particular, I'm going to present the link on the role of institutional investors in low carbon assets. Climate change is a very well-known story, so we all know that now we need to make more investments in order to avoid extreme events, in order to keep the temperature well below a 2-degree increase from pre-industrial levels. Just last year was signed the Paris Agreement, and in order to meet those targets, we absolutely need to scale up the actual investment level. When it comes to low carbon power generation, we need to increase the actual investment level by a factor of 3, while when it comes to efficiency, we need to increase by a factor of 8. And here are where we are now, basically. Just a couple of years ago, the last data available are from 2014, and the climate finance reached somehow around $400 billion. And here we track investments regarding investment in mitigation, adaptation, and energy efficiency. In the second chart, as you can see the breakdown between public and private efforts. Public investments have been kind of constant in the last years, while private sector have been decreasing their investments in 2013. And then the big question that we tried to answer was who has the highest potential to fill this financing gap. We decided to focus our research on institutional investors, given the importance of the assets they manage. As you can see from the chart, in the last 10 years, they have been always increasing the assets under management. Just in 2015, here the data reported in 2012, they managed something as $19 trillion. As you can see here, we have investment funds, insurance companies, pension funds. Those investors, we thought they might fill the gap because they have long-term investment horizon and long-term liabilities that somehow can match very well the characteristics of low-carbon investments. The study we conducted at UCL was try to interview those investors and try to understand what are the main barriers and the risks that are perceived by investors in order to overcome the financial barriers and to have a greater involvement of those investors. Our methodology was then to interview investors in Europe, but also in the United States. We were able to target pension funds and insurance companies. However, we also included few academics, asset managers, and advisors. Regarding our sample, we were able to include asset owners who actually manage $4 trillion and asset managers that represent $5.5 trillion. One of the first points we tried to understand in our research was how they make investment decisions. And the investment decisions are mainly led by this financial metric, that is the risk-adjusted return. What means, what are the returns that are expected given different level of risks associated to a specific investment. When we try to explore this question with investors, we were able to understand that there are mainly 3 groups of barriers. One can be including the government support. The second group is about investment and market condition. And finally, the last group of barriers, it's more related to the institutional investors' characteristics and capability. The first point was absolutely the credible policy regulatory framework. All investors say that and stress the importance of a clear, stable policy framework. This is absolutely the key to that drives basically investment. Most of our participants in the survey, for instance, mentioned the Spanish and the Italian case study regarding the solar PV and the feed-in tariff. In particular, in Spain, the feed-in tariff had some retroactive change, and also in Italy we had several changes in the feed-in tariff in only a few years. And those have been mentioned as some of the most important barriers that really killed the solar market in these two countries. The second point was more linked to investment channels. The question was, lead or be led? One of the main issues is really about what are the best investment channels. And institutional investors have mainly two channels. They can invest directly or indirectly in low carbon assets. If they want to invest directly, they need to have some in-house expertise, so that means a dedicated team. And in our case, only few investors, and only the bigger investors were able to maintain, to keep these specialized team in their organizations. Most of our participants, they were investing through funds and external managers. But even in this case, this channel was quite expensive. Indeed, they had to pay the 2% fee on top of the assets they give to funds, external managers to invest in low carbon assets, but also they need to pay a performance fee that ranges between 10 to 15%. Low carbon investments are also perceived as young opportunities, and those are the main issues. First of all, there is a lack of tradable financial instruments. For institutional investors, it's really important the kind of financial assets they can invest in low carbon. They are looking mainly for liquid assets. So, for instance, bonds matches particularly well these characteristics. However, the green bond market is still very limited compared to the bond market. If we think about the volume of traded green bonds compared to the bond market, it's less than 1%. So again, the liquidity is not really there. Another issue relates to the project sites. Projects in low carbon are still too small. The minimum sites that institutional investors suggested as kind of an attractive sites is about 100 million. And finally, another barrier related to the investment condition, it's about the lack of high-quality data on low-carbon investments as standard reporting. So there is really an issue about data disclosure and also all the risks associated to those kind of investments. We have finally another group of barriers that relates more to the characteristics of institutional investors. In this case, it was quite mentioned by many of our participants, the lack of management experience and track record. Indeed, in many cases, managers are not really the right profile to invest in those assets. They lack experience in the sector and there is not a strong track record. Another issue was about the mandate, in particular about the fiduciary duty. This argumentation was not really raised in Europe, but was particularly important and mentioned quite often with participants based in the US. Indeed, they say that fiduciary duty is the strong argumentation in order to not invest in low carbon assets. And finally, also the investors admit that for them it's quite difficult to apply analytical approaches such as carbon pricing or portfolio carbon footprinting to their organization. And then those difficulties in applying such methodologies do not really help them in the right and correct assessment of the investments in low carbon. And finally, we tried to underline some actions and what can be done in order to overcome those barriers. We mainly found those main actions and policies. First of all, here I reported this one quote that I liked a lot from one of our participants. It basically suggests that policy frameworks need to be the 3L, long, loud, and legal, underlying really the importance of a strong and clear, stable policy framework. Another action should go in the implementation of policy that are able to alter the balance of economics between low carbon investments and traditional investments. It was quite mentioned the importance of a carbon pricing and hopefully a global carbon pricing. Then again, investors asked for more data disclosure and transparency. This is another important factor in order to invest in the sector. A final point raised was also the importance of the involvement of development finance institutions. In particular, here was mentioning the new role that it should take, specifically in addressing the risks, but also in helping in the due diligence process and also in aggregating the projects. As I said, one of the main issues was the size of the projects, and most of investors are seeing in institutions like the World Bank or the European Investment Bank the role of aggregator of the market. And finally, that's my last slide. Here you can see our climate finance team at UCL. So you can see my two colleagues, Professor Michael Grubb and Paul Drummond, in case you're interested in knowing more about our projects.
Great, thanks very much, Nadia. That's very interesting and providing some detail on the investor perspective and work that's going on in GREEN-WIN. On that perspective, we're now going to move to the case study level and project level, and we're going to move to Mark de Bel from Deltaris, the expert economic advisor at Deltaris in the Netherlands, and he's going to tell us about ongoing work in the project on identifying win-win strategies in flood risk reduction. So, Mark, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Sandy. Welcome, everybody. I would like to take you to discuss a few case studies in coastal adaptation and specifically in flood risk reduction. I'll give a brief introduction, talk about the financing of the win-win strategies, do the case study of coastal adaptation, and try to close with some lessons learned. The problem underlying climate adaptation is often that there is a lack of sufficient funding, and there is a challenge to apply best practices in global flood risk reduction policies. So that is, what is learned in one country is sometimes very difficult to apply in another country. And we think that by identifying win-win strategies, we can provide more sustainable business models and create an enabling environment for the implementation of coastal adaptation. And this is what I'll try to demonstrate by the case study. When we talk about win-win strategies, what are we looking for? We can either look for private investments that will fund a coastal adaptation measure, or we can try to construct the project in such a sense that it will leverage public funding. So we can achieve adaptive, green and nature-based solutions more efficiently, and or try to do this under a collective action where stakeholders themselves try to organize themselves. I'll try to illustrate this in a case study about beach nourishment. In our southwestern delta of the Netherlands, there is exposure of the dikes due to sea level rise and coastal erosion. And for two sites, namely the Sophiabeach and the Oysterbeach, the dikes were actually the safety of the dikes was rejected by the Ministry of Infrastructure, and they were put for rehabilitation. Now, basically, what you can do this by heightening the dike itself, or in these two cases, the measure selected was a beach nourishment, which is putting sand in front of the dike in order to reduce the attack of the waves on the dikes, which means that the height of the dike does not need to be increased. This is the location of the Oysterbeach, where at this location the sand was put in front of the dike. What you see is that additional sand from the deeper areas of the delta is put on the beach, and this sand was stabilized by these type of oyster reefs, hence the name, which is filled with empty oysters shells, and the, let's say, oysters like this material very much as a substrate. So sand is trapped behind these small reefs, and as the oysters, the live oysters will grow on these reefs, they will also keep the sand there, and while growing will trap more sand behind these reefs. This is slightly different from the Sophiabeach location, where also here by coastal erosion there was a receding line towards the dike, and thus the wave attack on the dike would increase. So also here there was an option to take the current high water line, which is the dashed and dotted line in this picture, and put sand on the beach so that the high water flood line will go to the dotted and crossed line. This not only in this case protected the existing dike, but also opened up opportunity for the construction of beach houses. Now, as you can see, these beach houses are constructed on poles, and they remain, say, outside the dike all year round, and they are built in such a way that the expected lifespan of these houses coincides with the expected lifespan of the return period of high floods, which is somewhere between 1 in 50 and 1 in 100 years. Now, if you look at the costs of the two case studies for Oysterbeach, the reference of a more traditional approach, which is just heightening the existing dike, and compare that with the beach nourishment. Not only was the beach nourishment less expensive, also because of the loss of biodiversity caused by the coastal erosion, there are, let's say, negative benefits in the traditional case, and there is positive benefits from the beach nourishment, mainly due to increase in biodiversity, which opened up some small profits for tourism, oyster gathering, and small type of activities, which is quite, but there is no revenues. These are in a social cost benefit analysis identified as benefits, but there's no revenue, there's no cash flow from these activities. This is different from the case of Sophiabeach, where also here the beach nourishment was the slightly cheaper option compared to the traditional solution, but the benefits are much bigger. That's because the beach is in front of a recreational facility where a lot of tourists will come and in order to go to the beach. Well, continued coastal erosion will have that the beach will completely disappear. Thus you have negative benefits, and in the case of the beach nourishment there is more tourism, but also the opportunity to construct the holiday homes. So in both cases there is actually a revenue. So not only, let's say, the value of the biodiversity, but also actual revenue, which in the case of the traditional case would be negative, and loss of expenditures from tourists. And in the beach nourishment case, you have two distinct cash flows, one from additional tourism, which caused expenditures and let's say taxes back to government, and the sale of the real estate, the value of that real estate that is realized. And that of course also comes from use by tourists, but also by the sale of the land that is used for the houses to be constructed upon, and the sale of the houses, the real estate themselves. So these total benefits which we have identified, improved flood protection, improved ecological values, and increased tourism activities, do not all lead to actual revenues. And the revenues that we have been able to identify was increased spending from tourists, but only in the Sophiabeach case, and the sale of real estate. As there is very little tourism at the Oysterbeach location, we have identified benefits, but no revenues. So the lessons learned. So all these of both case studies were actually done because of a flood risk improvement or reduction in flood risk for these two locations. Both were used as pilots for nature-based solutions, which were actually quite successful. Both have been implemented, and they hinge on the development of the local economy. As it is shown, is that in the one case that worked better than in the other one. And what is clear from these two cases, that real estate development is really an attractive measure to be included in this type of measures, because it really brings a revenue, a cash flow. So how are these revenues generated? We see that services such as tourism, which cause local businesses to thrive, and possible tax revenues for local municipalities, and sale of newly created land or real estate really brings in big revenues. With this also the public sector benefits because of sales taxes and let's say value-added tax that can be levied on tourism services. So this is the end of my presentation, and if you need any more information or comments, these are my contact details. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Mark. That's a very interesting presentation on actually how economic benefits can be generated within flood risk reduction projects. Again, I'd like to remind you all that that it's possible to ask questions, and please continue to do so through the webinar portal, and we'll get to all of your questions to the panel following the final presentation. So moving from Mark, now we'll move on to Yuji, who will speak to us about the co-evolution between sustainability and business innovation, and present some evidence on this from the sharing mobility sector in Shanghai. So please, Yuji, the floor is yours. It seems we have a bit of a technical difficulty here. We're just waiting for Yuji to come online. I'll give her another minute or two, or moment or two. Please bear with us for just a second. Okay, I see that Yuji's here, and so please, Yuji, the floor is yours. Continue.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. Hello everyone, I'm Yu from the Oxford team of the GREEN-WIN project. Today I will talk about our case study in Shanghai and the co-evolution mechanism we recently conceptualized between the macro level, the city level transformation towards sustainability, and the business level innovation for GREEN-WIN. In this presentation, I will briefly talk about the background of our work package, the Shanghai case study, the co-evolution mechanism, and conclude with the next step plan. The work package 6 is based at Oxford. We asked a research question that under what enabling environment can opportunity spaces that contain win-win strategies and green business models achieve transformation towards sustainability in urban areas. We have 4 case studies, which are Shanghai, Istanbul, Barcelona, and Venice. So today I will focus on the Shanghai case. Shanghai is one of the biggest mega cities in the world. It has more than 30 million residents. It is one of the biggest energy consumers and carbon emitters in global cities. And our study shows that the mobility sector of Shanghai, which generate around 1/3 of its PM 2.5, is experiencing disruptive innovation brought about by the emerging sharing economy business models. And we identify the synchronization between those emerging sharing mobility business models with the public transport and other sustainable urban transport modes can provide huge opportunities for Shanghai's sustainable transformation. First, we contextualize Shanghai in terms of these three very important sustainable urban development constructs. One is physical constraints, one is knowledge system, the third is socioeconomic relationship. The arrow shows a more sustainable direction. So Shanghai shows we conceptualize it as 4 layers of the megacity context. The first layer is a long-standing aspiration to become a global city, which means a center for economic growth and cultural and technological innovations. But the second layer, which is a very recent development, is that after 30 years of rapid urban expansion, the Shanghai Authority has realized the city has reached its physical limit of growth, which is here. So in the latest urban planning, Shanghai 2040, the government explicitly used bottom line control to control the population, land, energy, and resource growth in order to deal with the physical constraint. So these 2 layers, within those physical constraints, the third layer is shown in the whole city's determination to advance its digital domain, to sustain economic growth in the digital technology in the smart city, and it is shown in this vast spread of ICT infrastructures. And all these 3 forces laid down the foundation for the disruptive innovation of the sharing economy, which essentially use big data technologies to scale up all kinds of sharing mobility schemes. And we, through stakeholder workshops, interviews, and secondary data analysis, we identified 3 most representative business models in Shanghai's sharing mobility sector, which are in ride sharing, electric vehicle sharing, and bike sharing schemes. And now I will go into these 3 companies into details. We work very closely with these 3 companies in order to understand this transformational opportunity space. The first wave of the sharing mobility business model started in 2012. This company is called Didi, which is the Chinese Uber. It's easier to understand it in that way. And within 2 to 3 years, this company became a unicorn startup. From a company of 20 people, now it's a company employ about 5,000 people. It's in 2016, it was valued at $36 billion, and the Chinese government was the first national government to legalize this kind of ride-sharing business model in July 2016. So the difference, this Chinese Uber Didi not only provide ride-sharing across 400 cities in the country, it also provide all kinds of carpooling and minibus and customized vans, shared vans for urban dwellers. It merged Uber's China operation in August 2016, but only about 3-4 months after the national government legalizes business model, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou, the 4 major cities in China, put very strict regulations on this business model, which effectively phased out 90% of its practice. And the second wave of the sharing mobility in Shanghai started 1 or 2 years later. After the first wave of sharing mobility, it was this electric vehicle rental system sharing platform called EV Card. Unless the Didi business model, which was a purely private startup. This EV car was set up by the government. Developing electric vehicle has been China's national strategy since the 1980s, but it has not been that successful as expected, especially in terms of market promotion. So the government saw the sharing mobility as a technological disruption. So it leveraged this new technology to develop a state-owned electric vehicle rental system to provide huge policy support, including free car licenses. Free or subsidized electric vehicles. The majority of them were manufactured by Shanghai city-owned automobile companies, and a lot of parking resources. Promoting electric vehicle rental system was also written into Shanghai's urban planning a year ago. Until now, this company has developed 2,600 rental stations, around 8,000 electric vehicles in 23 cities across the country. And the third wave of the sharing mobility, which is even more revolutionary, is a bike sharing, free-floating bike sharing company called Mobike. This company started its operation in Shanghai in April last year, and within 10 months, it placed more than 100,000 bikes in Shanghai, in one city, and it operates in about 23 cities across China. And this business model is really bringing a huge change to urban mobility. A lot of people now, China used to be a kingdom of bicycles, but then it went through a period of automation, and now it is coming back to cycling plus metro in this wave of the sharing, bike sharing business model wave. And this business model is supported by many district governments, and it successfully raised more than $400 million of private investment from Chinese, American, and Singaporean venture capitalists. So, and as we see, these three waves of the sharing mobility business models, although all of them were surrounded by this technological and business model disruptive innovation about this smart sharing platform, but we see clearly it is going towards more and more sustainable transport modes. And we conceptualize it in this chart that the starting point was very strict. It started around 2012. It was very strict car ownership control in Shanghai. It was insufficient public transport and growing informal market of private ride sharing, car sharing to meet the unmet demand. And the first wave of the sharing mobility, the Chinese Uber Didi, it was a disruptive change, but it was aiming at promoting efficiency. So because of the rebound effect, it made a negative impact to the physical constraint of the city because it increased the travel demand. And in the second wave, the government leveraged the sharing mobility innovation that was started in the private sector to provide sustainable transport solution. That's the second wave. So it brought more sustainable impact to the physical limit of the city. It also promotes more sustainable knowledge system, but its socioeconomic impact is very marginal because it provides transport solution to a very small proportion of the population. But in the third wave, the startups leverage the sharing mobility business model, align itself with the city level's transformation towards sustainable future to bring bicycles, to bring a greener transport mode into this picture. So we see the third the third wave of it. And along this transformation, the previous, like for example, the first wave of the sharing mobility business model was also reinventing itself, focusing more on the sustainable solutions. For example, the carpooling and the mini bus, instead of the purely ride-sharing business models. So in the next step, we will investigate more about its enabling environment in the aspect of visionary, cultural cognitive, policy regulatory, organizational, and economic, different aspects using different methods to see how can we foster these win-win opportunities. If you want more information, we recently have a working paper on this topic. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ju, for a very interesting presentation, which I think showed quite clearly the complex dynamics between public actors and business organizations in developing that business model. I now would ask all panelists to turn their webcams on, as we're going to turn to the panel section and Q&A section of this webinar. We've collected questions from the audience thus far, and I'll start with some of those. And then you see on your screen as well some questions that we've collected in advance of the webinar that from the audience that we'll also turn to. We're a little bit behind schedule, but we should have a good 20 minutes of discussion now based on this Q&A. So as the Q&A has come in through the course of the 4 presentations, we have some more general questions, as well as some more directed to specific presentations. But I think to kick things off, I will start at the more general level. And so here we have a question from Fungmaya Huram, who asks, well, achieving climate goals and economic development in the global south is highly dependent on development assistance from donor countries. And however, the lack of commitment from donor countries has been one of the major challenges. And the question is whether the panel could please shed some light on this challenge of mobilizing donor finance for these win-win strategies. So I think I'll first ask that to the panel if someone wants to jump in.
Yes, I can have a go here. Thanks, Sandy. Thanks for this question. I guess there are 2 answers to this question. There is the question of upscaling donor finance globally, which is a much discussed question within the climate negotiations and also within development context. And there, I think our project does not really have to offer something new. There are huge political barriers involved, and that are also difficult to address as many donor countries pursue rather well, narrowly defined own interests with their donor funding. Yeah, that's really a difficult question to address. However, in terms of win-win approaches, what we are looking into is how to better leverage the available funding. So certainly those kind of win-win opportunities that we identify could actually lead to a more effective implementation of the available donor funding. Furthermore, if we actually discover that also in the development country context, there are win-win projects that could be realized as a green business model, so basically that are self-sufficient in financing, then those projects could be undertaken without development finance needs, but simply by getting a loan or on the capital market. So this, in that respect, our work contributes to this development finance issue. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So that sheds a little bit of light on the development finance angle. If anyone, if no one else wants to jump in on that, then I'll move to the next question. And so here we have we have a question here that actually, well, it's a question from Charles Savage, and this moves on to a more specific policy instrument. And the question is it necessary to put a cost on carbon to generate more win-win efforts? And here I think this question goes to Nadia's presentation, and maybe she can shed a little bit more, provide a bit more detail on what the institutional investors had perspective was on the cost of carbon in their investment strategies. And I'd also ask Yuki to think or to maybe comment on what role that might have played or what effect that could have in the development of business models in the urban sector. But first, if we can start with Nadia.
So thanks. In my case, many of my participants in the survey really underline the need of carbon pricing in order to lead to switch investments from traditional asset classes towards low carbon. However, I have to say that carbon pricing can be just one of the policy, one of the tools that we can employ. What is more important is to provide a commitment and a stable policy framework. So it doesn't really matter if we decide to move more towards feed-in tariff or carbon pricing or other kind of instruments and tools. What is important really to provide some commitment, something that is going to be stable, and in order to see some stable cash flows, and in order to build some confidence in the market that the instruments will be there for 10 or 20 years, and then investors can decide how to allocate their portfolio. So I think carbon pricing was mentioned quite often, but it's one tool that we can use and that basically investors are wishing for. But I think what is more important is really to see some strong signals from the government for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I totally agree with Nadia that the government commitment for carbon reduction is the key to motivate the business sector. For example, in the Shanghai's case, as I just showed, after the Shanghai government published its 2040 master plan and made a very explicit bottom line control for population growth, for energy consumption and carbon emission growth, the business, we saw very strong response from the private finance, especially the venture capitalists. They started to invest very heavily in this green business, green transport mode, because they saw that as a certain future. So I think carbon price is one of the policy tools, but for the investors interested in urbanization, interested in urban development, they want something more direct policy commitment, such as a bottom line control, such as a commitment for energy consumption growth and carbon emission growth.
Good, thanks very much. I mean, I actually have a follow-up question on that Shanghai case that I would ask then directly. So that question is from Katrina Jaime, and she's asking whether there's an observable shift in Shanghai of riders from the mass transportation modes to these more individual modes of transport. So really on the details of numbers of riders.
Okay, so this bike sharing scheme started last April, so it's been 10 months. And the data for last month was that it provides 200 million rides within 10 months, which was really substantial. And so it grew from a scheme of a couple of bikes to a scheme of 100,000 bikes in Shanghai. So that's the latest data I have. And to add on that, those numbers, we also see a social transformation inspired by this green business model. Now, more and more people are investing their own time and energy to help this business model to work, because we know for free-floating bike sharing scheme, as we saw it in Europe as well in the past, that we would see problem like bike being stolen, being destroyed, or all kinds of misbehavior in such a large scheme, free-floating bike sharing business model. So now a lot of people are helping to regulate other people's behaviors in this business model. For example, if they saw someone park the bike in the wrong place, more and more people will go out to tell them that this is not correct, we should do things correctly. So we could see a start of potential of social transformation, and we're doing cultural cognitive surveys with the users to see whether those transformation will be sustained.
Thanks very much. Very interesting. So there's a number of factors really influencing the choices of individual users of transport. And yes, thanks. That provides some very interesting detail. I'd like to then move to now a bit the coastal flood risk protection cases. So here we have a question coming from Misha Madsen, and this would be directed then at Mark DeBell. So the question here is asking for a bit of detail on the funding of the projects presented. So was the beach nourishment project actually funded through private financing, and how was the business case then developed for the beach nourishment project?
Well, both case studies are part of the Dutch government's effort for flood risk reduction in the Netherlands. So both works were 100% financed by the government, also because they were pilots for nature-based solutions. They are projects that are extensively monitored, also to learn about the effectiveness of these beach nourishments and the technical lifespan. So, and also because the nourishments were cheaper to implement than would be a normal regular heightening of the dike, it was no problem for the government to fund these 100%. There are cases in the Netherlands where more nature-based solution type of implementation was more expensive, where then additional stakeholders, some public, some non-public, actually contributed to the financing. So that depends a little bit on a case-by-case situation.
I see. Thanks very much for that. So, I mean, having heard a bit of detail on two of the case study levels, I'd like to move to this more general level of Q&A, and actually, you see this question on your screen in front of you. So, and again, this is directed to the whole panel. So please jump in as you feel so inclined. Having heard this detail on the case study level, I mean, in your own work, are there common metrics to assess win-win business green business models? And yeah, that would be the question to the panel. And how does one go about doing that? Does anyone want to step in on that?
I can start, but I'm sure others can add to that. I mean, actually, in terms of it depends a bit. I mean, there's of course an economic side of the green business model, and there is an environmental side. The environmental side constitutes in measuring the climate goal achievement, and again, two sides: the mitigation side, where we are measuring the emission reduction, as well as the adaptation side, where we're interested in measuring climate risk, or if you want, the improvement in climate resilience. Both of those measurements have a huge literature, and there are issues involved in determining the baseline, so against what to measure the specific business model. Would it be an alternative business model that is maybe more gray than the green one, etc. So there are issues involved. Yeah, maybe to make the long story short, I think this really needs a detailed consideration depending on the type of cases you're looking at. In some cases it's easier, in other cases it is actually more difficult. And what I also understand from so far our research on the financing side of those business models, this actually is a huge challenge. So for investors and also donors to understand how green a business model is, one really needs to understand the details, and that is not something that can be done in the general for all green business models alike. And yeah, just to refer back to Nadia's point made earlier, this constitutes also a barrier for investors that don't have the know-how to really judge on the specific environmental performance of win-wins or business models. Thank you very much.
I can, yeah, just to add to Johan's point, I completely agree that it's very complicated. Like every business case is different, as we see in the Shanghai case and other urban transformation cases, that the business landscape is changing very fast. The business model worked last month may not work this month, and the investors that invested in business A last quarter may not be willing to invest in this business model continually, or they found something new, especially in this digital domain or things related to the digital domain. So what we are defining the real metrics or the fundamental criteria for sustainable transformation is that whether it can bring positive changes to the cultural cognitive aspect, to bring in more sustainable knowledge, more sustainable cognition to the mass population. So that's something we are trying to develop more tangible indicators at the moment.
If I just can add just a few comments, Sandy. I would like to say that regarding those big investors, the common metrics that we'll need is really try to understand how climate change can affect financial stability. And in this sense, it's important to somehow factor those kind of risks in terms of physical risks, liability risks, and transitional risks. Those are the main kind of risks that somehow have to be factored and included in the investment assessment and the appraisal. So those are kind of the matrix that investors are looking for, and where there is a huge gap because we are not able yet to basically include those risks in the assessment of the investment.
Great, thank you. Good. I think that's quite a comprehensive picture of actually metrics from very different levels and the challenges involved in developing them in this what is a relatively new sector. So I think we have time for a couple of more questions if we keep things short. I have one here. Again, addressing the question of whether one of the panelists can speak on experiences in green business models in extractive industries such as fisheries or forests. And the question is whether there are also sustainability or green business models in these type of industries which can reduce environmental impacts.
I mean, I'd be happy. Please, Mark.
Yeah, because actually in the GREEN-WIN, I'm not aware that we have any project in this sense in fisheries or the like. But I do know from other projects that we are looking to include the more sustainable let's say mode of producing into let's say fish farming or seaweed farming, and combining that for optimizing the use of the water resources. So yes, it's being done, but not to my knowledge in this project, and I couldn't name a current ongoing example. But we have done some work on the possibilities of combining more sustainable production methods for, let's say, for shellfish farming in the southwestern delta.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just to briefly add to that, I mean, there is, of course, a lot of work on sustainable agricultural production, and in every aspect of that production, I think there are green business models involved. I think the closest we get, I think here in GREEN-WIN, is really the switching to coffee and cacao production using agroforestry systems in Indonesia, and this is something I think that that is quite promising. Also, I mean, in order for that business model to be competitive, it still needs to be evaluated against other potential business models that are less sustainable but maybe bring more revenues, and yeah, I think we are not there yet.
Great, thanks very much. So we hear that we do have some ongoing work in those areas, but again, the challenge is about developing, metrics and finding the right baselines to evaluate those kind of measures. I think given the time, although there are other questions coming through, we won't be able to get them all, and so I would at this point just like to thank the panel. I mean, I think we've had a very interesting session. I can see by the level of questions and amount of questions coming in that the work in the GREEN-WIN project certainly is developing quite a bit of interest. We heard about work going on in the project on many different levels, and an investor perspective in two of the case studies on urban transitions, as well as on the adaptation side and flood risk, and as well as hearing about the more general setting of the project in the ongoing global discourse on green growth and green economy. So I hope that the kind of discussion that we've had here has given some insight into what we are doing in the GREEN-WIN project and how the case studies and work on the investor level will contribute to to this ongoing transition towards sustainable economies. I mean, for me, then it seems like the next step in the project will really be about bringing these two perspectives together. So we've heard about some of the limitations and barriers from the investor perspective, and we've heard about the interdependence and configurations between public and private parties in case studies at the local level and their interests and barriers in implementing these green business models. And so bringing these two perspectives together and making matches between that investor level and local level is something that we'll continue to work on as we go forward in the project. All of the presentations, and in fact this whole session has been recorded and will be available online through the GGKP website. You are very welcome to follow up with the GGKP or with the presenters, including myself, directly if you have further questions or interested in the work. At this point, I think then I will close this the session, and I will thank again all of the panelists and also all of the participants for making this an interesting and valuable webinar, and I hope you enjoyed that. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.